I'm next joined by Dr Aseem Malhotra. He's a cardiologist, a public health campaigner, and I'd say a paradigm bulldozer as well. He's many things, and of course, probably well known to many of you. Welcome, Aseem, to UK Low Carb.
Dan, delighted to be here.
It's great to have you on, and particularly at the moment, of course, because you're somebody who's been campaigning on the issues of metabolic health for such a long time, and yet, of course, at the moment, it's particularly relevant what's happened with the pandemic. That's, well, the second pandemic, of course. The first one, I guess, was the metabolic health and the obesity crisis, but the second pandemic that's hit at the moment. Do you find, though, and this is what I think is interesting at the moment, your writing is so kind of key to what's happening at the moment, and yet the kickback from some people, I find quite shocking. How do you take that?
Yeah, so I think, Dan, we're dealing really with a paradigm shift, and in the way that people have, certainly in terms of the way we practice medicine. And, there are many people out there that will react to any kind of change to the status quo or threat to the status quo, especially if it's something they've become comfortable with, it's what they know. So you've got those, those individuals that will feel threatened or uncomfortable by something new that comes their way, especially when it comes to practicing medicine. And then the other side of it as well, I think that, there's a lot of very powerful vested interests, financially, that benefit from the current the way that things are, really, in terms of whether it's health information and how that's disseminated to the public, or whether it's the drug industry, whether it's the food industry, and how they profit from misleading people effectively. So I think it's inevitable that there will be a reaction. If there's no reaction, it means, from my perspective, that I'm not really making any progress. I see it as a backhanded compliment. But at the same time, you've got to have a thick skin. As I've said previously, the science alone isn't enough. Opposition from vested interests needs to be overcome. So that's just part and parcel of, I think, anybody who's in a position where, and especially someone that, for me, it's about also having the courage of my convictions, like other people that I see, who have done this over the years or in the same boat as me now. And if you speak with conviction, and that's the only real way to get change to happen, which is what we really all want, or certainly what I'm driving, then you are going to get people criticizing you. It's just inevitable. But the reality is, it's about, ultimately for me, what motivates me is the patient in the consultation room. Everything comes back to the patient, and my duty to help them live a healthy and happy life, ultimately. And also my responsibility and duty to scientific integrity. So I put those two things together, and that is always at the basis or the root or the core of what motivates me to do what I do.
See, because from a political background, I find the attacks that you have are very similar to what politicians face. And for instance, Professor Rory Collins, Oxford University, he made a comparison with your comment about statins in comparison to Andrew Wakefield and what he said about vaccines, as if they're anything similar at all. But that's a dog whistle to say, do you remember this and what a disaster this was? This is the same. And then it gets people scared, doesn't it? And it's a very subtle, well, not actually that subtle in that case, but it's quite a malicious way of attacking somebody, isn't it? To bring somebody down. Yeah,
it's an interesting analogy that Professor Collins used there. I think for me, if anything, being involved in this and getting to the roots of, the issues around cholesterol and the mass prescription of statins, etc. Actually, for me, it was he was actually exposing himself through that comment. And what I mean by that is that there was something much deeper beyond actually having rational debate. And Professor Collins and his department have received well over £200 million from drug companies that manufacture statins, but that wasn't at the forefront in any of the news reporting. So to be honest, he's I think it reinforces, if you like, that what I'm saying and what I'm doing, I'm on the right track here. When people make comments like that, when they can't actually debate exactly what you're saying, then and they start going for the player rather than the ball, then you're on the right track. I think you just got to have a thick skin to be able to deal with it, and then be able to really just carry on in that movement of which is ultimately about truth and transparency. I mean, statins is a very long topic, but in essence, there still is a lack of transparency in their prescription, because the original data and the trials were all sponsored by the drug company. The original data hasn't been made available for independent analysis. And that's on the background of huge discrepancies between what the clinical trials reported when it comes to side effects specifically, and what we as clinicians and doctors are seeing with patients and what patients are experiencing in the real world. And that is really at the heart of the whole debate about statins. It's not about whether they work or not. It's about how effective they are and how prevalent are the side effects. And then are patients being allowed to make informed decisions about whether to take them or not? That's basically the sort of three areas that are that need to be reinforced of what I push for. And I think it's very difficult for people, even on the the vested interest side, to argue against it. And therefore, when they can't argue against it, they then result in smearing and statin deniers and all sorts of nonsense that you see smeared across the internet at times.
Yeah, and that's the thing, I guess, nowadays. Everyone can share whatever they want, whenever they want on social media, can't they? So you can get the whole stirring up of rubbish. And I know you and I have been involved in something recently where some pretty nasty things were said about you and your ideas, which is, by the way, I think, somebody who hasn't read your book. That is quite obvious to me. There's nothing...
But I think, Dan, it's beyond... You're right. But I think not reading the book is only one part of it.
Yeah,
because,
it's a vested interest
there's
as well,
much more beyond that, And some of it, it's a mixture of things. It's very difficult to know exactly always what's motivating somebody. Some of it can be just pure, someone who wants to be a contrarian. Some of it can be jealousy. Some of it can be racism. Some of it can be the vested interests related to it. Some of it can be just a deep insecurity of having to deal with someone who is contradicting their beliefs. So there's so many different aspects that play into it. But it's about, I think we all ultimately, most human beings want to do the right thing. I think we all have a sense of justice and we hate injustice. So for me, that gives me hope that change will happen, because ultimately most people want to do the right thing. It's just that they need to be given all the information to really know what's happening and how they are being deliberately misled for reasons that are not good reasons for money, motive, for profit, for greed, ultimately. Once everybody knows that, is exposed to all of those root causes behind these, this misinformation, then we can change the system.
Yeah. So let's get into how we're going to change the system, because I've read your book. I'm halfway through reading it again because I really enjoyed the 21-day immunity plan. And there's something, you really knocked me for six with a comment that you made in there. I think it's actually from a quote from somebody else about, of course, prevention is the cure, but actually the impact of medicine in life expectancy, we would expect, I think it's like a 40-year increase in life expectancy. Most of us would think it's probably 30 plus years because of modern medicine, but actually it's public health reform that has delivered the increase in life expectancy, in particular, the 19th century and kind of early to middle, late 20th century, which has kind of increased life expectancy. That I found quite shocking. So in a way then, the medicine's trying to cure a problem that's being caused by something else, that we have to get to the root of it. And I thought, well, I won't obviously explain your whole book, but I think that for me was so powerful. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dan. I wanted to put that early on in the book, just to give people a perspective, because, we need to have a national discussion and debate about the limitations of modern medicine. We often don't have that at all. Yeah. And the truth is, good health rarely, if ever, comes out of a medicine bottle. So I think we need to start from that understanding, because a lot of our behavior, even the way that healthcare resources are distributed, are based upon perceptions and beliefs that are often wrong and not evidence-based. So when it comes to modern medicine, and specifically in reference to that, one analysis, which was a survey of students and adults, relatively well educated, and they were asked, in America, it was, looking at life expectancy had increased by about 40 years since 1850 to now. What percentage of those years, or how many of those years do you attribute to modern medicine? And most people attributed about 80% of those years, so 32 of those 40 years were attributed to modern medicine. When the reality is, when you break it down, it's probably anywhere between maybe 3 and 5 years max. And a lot of that has been for treating acute conditions, antibiotics for infections, for example, vaccinations for certain infections, emergency care, emergency surgery, development of coronary care units. these are the kind of, modern medical advances that have really, dialysis for kidney patients, insulin for type 1 diabetics. These are the kind of, medicines. It's actually only a handful. It's a small number of things that you can really pinpoint and say, and on the population level, this is what has been responsible for increasing life expectancy. What has actually increased life expectancy is things that, in the modern era, we don't often discuss or talk about very much because, they're much less relevant now because our ancestors, our grandparents and before them and the society, they sorted it out, which was things like, better, safer working environments, smoke-free buildings, seatbelts in cars, better sanitation and safe drinking water, things that we take for granted now were major issues at the end of the 19th century and into the early and mid 20th century. Smoking is a great example because as a cardiologist, one of the things that isn't upfront and discussed enough is that, when you look at the biggest decline in heart disease death rates that have happened in the last few decades, which now unfortunately are starting to increase again slightly, about 50% of all of that decline can be attributed purely to reduction in smoking prevalence, which was 50 to 60% of the adult population was smoking in the 50s and 60s, and it's less than 20% now. Most of the decline in heart disease deaths has happened because since the 70s basically has happened because of reduction in smoking. And that has been because of regulation, because of political engagement. So I think that these things were important to mention, certainly early on in the book, because ultimately a lot of the information we receive down on a day-to-day basis that influences our decision-making in terms of what we buy, what we eat, the clothes we wear, is all industry-driven. Ultimately, it's pharmaceutical industry that want to give you the idea about these new magic breakthroughs. How often do you hear in the news that, it's health is extremely important to most people. And therefore, for news stories, it's a great, their health stories, dominate often what people read on the internet even. And you hear, and a lot of the information you receive through headlines are basically industry-driven press releases, that come through medical journals that receive funding from the pharmaceutical industry. And then the headline is a gross exaggeration at best of actually the reality of what this so-called new drug is going to do or whatever. And that just, that repetitive, that sort of, that constant tsunami, if you like, over the years of what is really advertising influences our beliefs. We need to take a step back and say, hold on a minute, actually, 3 years ago, the whole headlines about this new blockbuster drug on Alzheimer's disease. And 3 years later, it works out actually it hasn't done anything. But no one's the story aren't counteracting it every day saying modern medicine is rubbish. That would be a great story. Modern medicine is rubbish, right? Okay, there's a nuance there. Not all medicine is rubbish, but a lot of it is. A lot of it is absolute nonsense. And patients are being prescribed drugs, most of which will not benefit when it comes to chronic disease management. And they're not being told it, Dan. So there's an ethical issue here. There's a lack of transparency. There's, so there's all of this stuff that feeds into which in my lectures, I basically start with just to try and get people to, understand it. And most doctors aren't aware of it. So most doctors aren't aware of it. And if doctors are misinformed, you then get misinformed patients. And we've got this epidemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients.
But I think it also
if we
changes
start
the paradigm.
From there, we can sort a lot of our healthcare problems once people know and get that to start with.
Don't you think, though, as well, it changes the paradigm? So I remember when I was about 16, I think we're a similar age, kids were starting to smoke and they were like, well, there'll be a cure for this one day when I'm getting to the age when I'll have problems from smoking. Because the mindset was, well, I'm taking a drug to solve the problem rather than I should do something to not create the problem in the first place. And I don't know, you'd have a much better idea than I would on this, that some people might use statins thinking they've got a free pass to live the lifestyle they want because the drug gives them that get out of jail free card, but it doesn't, does it? Just in the same way, you shouldn't smoke thinking in the future you'll have a cure for it, rather deal with it at source.
Absolutely. So it's, the illusion of protection. Absolutely. For statins, is one example where we've had such an obsession about lowering cholesterol or high cholesterol being bad for you, etc., or going to give you a heart attack. That patients and Dan, I say this not just as somebody who analyzes research, does original research and publishes on that. I say this as a practicing clinician who spent almost 2 decades in the NHS and has probably managed or been involved in the care of well over 20,000 patients. We have a very high volume of people that we see in the NHS. So from my own clinical experience and conversations with patients, yes, this is absolutely true. Some patients think that because they're taking a pill that affects a blood marker, won't prolong their life at all necessarily, especially if they haven't had a heart attack, that means they can eat what they like. And that's it. That's where it ends for them. Their cholesterol is low. I'm not going to have heart disease. I can eat whatever I eat, Burger King or McDonald's or whatever, without naming any particular, but fast food.
Yeah.
So that is a big problem, because if you just, conceptually or theoretically, that N equals 1 patient who gets prescribed a statin and goes away thinking that, okay, and is actually, as a doctor, by not understanding what the true benefits of statins are, not understanding what the patient's perceptions of the benefits are, and then if they go away and think that it gives them a free license to do what they like with their lifestyle, you are, in essence, as a doctor, causing harm to that patient. It is overall net harm.
Yep. That's wow. Yeah. Can I just take you back in time, Aseem? Because I like to always think about how we can learn from history. And as a kind of qualified history teacher in the past and a bit of a politics geek, I spent my Sunday evening going through Hansard. And I just thought public health is, the name of the game we're talking about today. So I thought I'd share a quote with you and then just reflect on how our ancestors have dealt with things and how maybe we should learn from the past. So this is a quote from Parliament. "Upon the health of our people depend the prosperity, welfare and greatness of the nation. And I hold it to be the primary duty of the legislature to omit no means for the purpose of securing the health of the labouring classes of the community. I shall feel convinced that no man who really feels as an Englishman, no man who is a friend of humanity, can propose to deprive the country of the necessary means of preserving the public health." And that's a Public Health Act Amendment Bill by Viscount Palmerston in July 1854. And of course, what that leads on to is eventually the sewage system being put into London to stop the public health, because of course they were having a problem with cholera. Now, the analogy I'd make here is they didn't try to find a pill or a drug to cure cholera. They realized that cholera is being caused by something. So let's get to the source of the problem. And interestingly, a decade later, in fact, 12 years later, 1866, I think it was, they had the very last outbreak of cholera in London. It was no longer a problem. It went away. I find it interesting. We think we're so advanced, and yet we're looking at a problem and saying, well, let's use medicine to try to heal you of the problem, rather than going, hang on a minute, we've got feces in the streets to get rid of. That is the problem. Or we've got our own feces and it's in our own arteries and our own bodies. And I thought, isn't it interesting how the Victorians understood public health was the cure? We see cure as the kind of end point to the actual treatment, rather than the actual solution is at the very source.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with me, Dan. I think there was a lot we can learn from history, and if you don't learn from history, then you're bound to live through it again. And, we see, I give the analogy, I've given this before many times, when one of the biggest threats to our health and sustainability of our healthcare today is essentially bad food, ultra processed food that our bodies were not designed to eat, foods that are not nourishing, foods that encourage overconsumption, that create inflammation in the body, that make you, control your, affect your appetite control mechanisms that can lead to you becoming overweight and have excess body fat and all the conditions that go with it. And the question is, why is that happening? And it's because, one of the, if not the major root causes, is the behavior of the food industry. This is what they are giving us to eat. And then when there are attempts by people in public health, to try and, limit their manipulations and excesses in terms of the way they market these products and the way they mislead people into buying them as health foods, for example, then they adopt exactly the same corporate playbook strategy that tobacco did for decades to stop any regulation when the links between smoking and lung cancer were first published. And they include just downright denial, confusing the public. I see some of these battles going on at the moment where I think, we're seeing the confusion going on. You're saying this and this person's saying this. This is part and parcel. This battle has to go on, but it's gone on through history. Yep. So part of their, they want to confuse the public. And then it's also about, buying the loyalty of scientists and planting doubt, that, for example, cigarettes were harmful. and also get political allies as well. They get their political allies. So the food industry have done exactly, they copied big tobacco in exactly the same way. And, you know, I highlight that we have to learn from history. We haven't got 4 or 5 decades, Dan, to allow this to continue without any real regulation, because we've already witnessed with what's happened with COVID, but our healthcare systems are collapsing.
Yeah.
And intuitively, people know there's something wrong. There is so much misery out there that isn't, you know, it's unnecessary. A lot of people are suffering. So we have to do something about it. And carrying on the same way that we're doing at the moment isn't going to work. And tinkering on the edges isn't going to work either. This needs a complete overhaul of the system. Yeah. And it needs, you know, major crisis needs major intervention. We need a radical change.
It's funny you say that. So that actual quote from Hansard, when I read through, then the comments which followed it, and I'll put it on a link on a website, but basically people then were objecting, saying you shouldn't bully somebody into cleanliness. You shouldn't bully someone to have their manure taken away. And of course, you know why, because they'd have to pay more taxes to then have that service put in, and people, for the sake of money, fought against public health. So this is a long battle, and you're part of that kind of story as well. But let's dive straight in then to the book. So you give, I think, the best description of metabolic ill health, or metabolic health syndrome, should I say, that I think I've ever read. It just defined it in one place. You don't talk about BMI, and there's a good reason for that, I know. But I just want to just share with the listeners a bit about how would you define somebody who has a metabolic health syndrome problem? And secondly, I know it's a bit of an estimate based on US numbers, but how big a problem is this in the UK right now?
So first of all, I think in very simple terms, metabolic health, for people to understand, is a state in which your body's excess body fat becomes a risk for you when it comes to many health conditions. And specifically, you know, for me, as a cardiologist first and foremost, you know, it's basically the biggest risk factor or collection of risk factors for heart disease is something called insulin resistance, which are linked to excess body fat, which is then can be measured by markers, 5 different markers, which I'll talk about in a second. So there's heart disease, but it also is the precursor to type 2 diabetes. It's probably responsible for, you know, linked to about 50%, half of all people who have high blood pressure, you know, are going to have metabolic health as the underlying issue. It's very likely, you know, very strongly correlated and linked to cancer, and probably dementia and Alzheimer's as well. So these are really the big major health conditions that are, you know, lead to premature death and chronic ill health. So the reason why, and BMI, everybody knows the term obesity, but to define obesity, it's a very basic definition based upon something called body mass index, which is a calculation of your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And obesity is if you have a BMI over 30, being overweight is 25 to 30, and being so-called normal BMI is 18.5 to 25.
But it doesn't know if you've got muscle or fat, does it? It doesn't
exactly. So it doesn't. You're absolutely right. So BMI doesn't distinguish between your body fat percentage, your muscle mass, bone structure, ethnicity, sex, age. There's so many issues with it. So many problems with it. So what metabolic health does, it takes it further, in the sense that you're going to pick up high-risk people with obesity as well, but you're also going to pick up many people who have a normal BMI who don't realize they're at risk, and they again may have the illusion of protection that they're told by their doctor that you've got a normal weight or a healthy weight, which doesn't actually exist. You can have healthy, you know, optimal metabolic health, but there's no such thing as a healthy weight. And it's not a small proportion. I mean, certainly depending on what ethnicity you are, about 40% of people from South Asian origin who have a normal BMI, who have been told wrongly they've got a healthy weight, are actually metabolically unhealthy. Right. And about 20% of Caucasians, so 1 in 5 Caucasians, is still not a small number for Caucasians as well. And those 5 markers really, Dan, are not, you know, it's not a very sophisticated, expensive test. It's something very straightforward. It's routinely done in general practice, is really looking at your blood glucose. So if you're pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic from something called the HbA1c, then that would be one abnormal marker. If your blood pressure is above 120/80, to start with, you have something called pre-hypertension, or then high blood pressure. You've got waist circumference. If your waist circumference is increased, that's a much better determinant than BMI as well. And people can measure with a tape measure at home. And a very simple rule of thumb actually is if your waist circumference at your belly button is more than half of your height, then, you know, there's a very, very good chance that you've got excess abdominal obesity or whatever, body fat, and it's a problem for you. And then 2 markers of cholesterol. We call them triglycerides and HDL. So high triglycerides, which is a blood fat, which is not good. And HDL is your so-called good cholesterol, and you want that not to be low.
Right.
So any of those being abnormal means you haven't got optimal metabolic health. But the worst form of it is you have 3 of those as being abnormal. Then you've got something called metabolic syndrome. Now, 2/3 of people admitted with heart attacks have metabolic syndrome. So that is the big issue for when it comes to heart attacks, even though 75% of them will have so-called normal cholesterol levels. So clearly cholesterol is not the major issue.
That's be reassuring when they're having a heart attack.
Yeah, well, exactly. And then when you look at the links between metabolic syndrome and COVID-19 in terms of death rates, it so far has been shown in data that we have to be the highest risk of death and hospitalization. If you have metabolic syndrome and you have COVID-19, then you're 3.5 times more likely to die compared to people that don't have metabolic syndrome, and 5 times more likely to be hospitalized. And that so if you compare that to obesity is only double the risk, okay? And type 2 diabetes is double the risk on its own. So metabolic syndrome is really what we should be focusing on. And to answer your question that you asked me initially, in terms of optimal metabolic health, data in the United States suggests only 1 in 8 adults have optimal metabolic health. And it's likely we haven't got data here specifically measuring it, but it's likely to be similar here. So probably around 80% of the UK adult population have excess body fat that starts to increase their risk of health conditions in the medium to long term. And I think that's really where we need to start, because there is no real drug to manage metabolic syndrome. You've got individual, specific drugs for individual conditions, but actually the best way to manage it, certainly what seems to be with the literature we have at the moment, in terms of, that you can reverse metabolic syndrome in 21 days. So that was the essence of what we call 21-day plan. And it's not a small number. Some trials have shown up to 50% of people within 21 to 28 days, depending on what trial you look at, through lifestyle changes, can come out of metabolic syndrome. So that is really the premise, if you like, of that book. It's not a gimmick. It's not this is too good to be true. This is absolutely evidence-based. And it's a place where people can start, to change their life. And it's about giving them hope that this isn't a long, drawn-out process necessarily. You will start to feel better, and you'll start to see improvements in your health markers within 21 days. Obviously, it depends where you start from. If you're already metabolically healthy, it probably won't make much difference, in health markers. It might make a difference to your health and long-term health. But, for those people at highest risk, and that's a huge proportion of the adult population in the UK, it's going to make a big difference in a short space of time.
So how on earth do we get from you saying things like, eat not too carby green vegetables, fish, meat, those kind of real foods and non-processed foods? How have we ended up with a milkshake or a shake that's going to help people lose weight? I find that really weird. That doesn't seem like the natural conclusion at all to what you're suggesting. So where on earth did that come from? And secondly, our dear Prime Minister, of course, cycles to work each day. So should he just cycle a longer route? Obviously a bit of a devil's advocate there, because it's really interesting, isn't it? That basically when I was told a few years ago I needed to lose weight, the GP said to me, just, do more exercise, like, probably up to an hour a day, really intense exercise, and that'll make you lose the weight. And I did, and I damaged my knee, and it didn't get me anywhere. Probably
quite bad for your health, Dan. You're probably increasing your risk of getting chest infections and getting sick as well by doing that. But anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was going to say then, so in that case,
too much exercise will kill you. That should be we can put that out there. New public health message, right? Too much exercise will kill you.
You're the best doctor.
Then you'll have the public health people coming back saying, "Oh my God, Dr. Malhotra is saying don't do any exercise."
Yeah, the other extreme.
How damaging and dangerous.
He said sit and watch TV.
I didn't say that. I said too much exercise will kill you.
Well, hang on. Tell me about the life expectancy of athletes, because you do talk about this in the book, don't you?
Yeah, no, I mean, so the message I want to, get across, which again is evidence-based, is moderate activity. There's a bliss point when it comes to longevity, which is doing moderate activity, which is, in simple terms, 30 minutes of getting a bit out of breath 5 times a week. That's probably the bliss point when it comes to, for the most of the population, when it comes to longevity.
Yeah.
But, there was a very large observational study that looked at ex-Olympic athletes and sports people. And what it found was that elite athletes didn't live any longer than golfers or cricketers.
Yeah.
So a little bit goes a long way, but you don't get any extra benefit if you're an elite athlete. Now, of course, for a professional sports person, it's a different conversation altogether. A lot of these people, who are going to be fit athletes and peak performance at certain stages of their career probably need to do, you know, for performance purposes, many of them doing several hours of exercise, you know, a day. I have a lot of interaction with, you know, people I won't specifically name, but I've very, very good friends who are sports doctors for, you know, football teams, international football teams, or sports teams. So I have regular conversations with these people, and you know, they know this very well. Is that one is, you know, for a lot of these athletes, because of the amount of exercise they're doing, because of their metabolism, their genetics, you know, they can get away with eating certain types of foods right now. But if you follow these people up, Dan, look at these. You know, I'm not going to name anybody. It wouldn't be fair to single somebody out. But I've seen ex-footballers. I've met them in green rooms of interviews I've done. People I grew up watching, thinking these people were amazing. You know, footballers, strikers, and stuff like that. They have got the phenotype of metabolic syndrome now in their 40s and 50s. They've got pot bellies. Yeah. You know, so what's going on there? So we have to have that conversation. You know, about and a lot of those athletes aren't being well informed about their nutrition either. You know, I think the science is evolving, but a lot of them are not. So there's a huge other conversation to be had here. But you know, the bottom line is a little bit of exercise goes a long way. I'm a huge advocate for it. But I think just think a little bit more that you can't outcycle a bad diet. And, you know, in terms of when it comes to burning calories, exercise isn't that great unless you're doing hours and hours and hours of it. The main focus should be food when it comes to your weight. And certainly the only intervention, Dan, that has shown on its own to reverse metabolic syndrome within a few weeks is dietary change. You can't do this from exercise alone. No way. If you just chose to do lots of exercise and didn't change your diet, you would not reverse metabolic syndrome. Or if you did, it was a very, very small proportion of people that can do that. The only intervention that has the biggest impact on this on its own is poor diet. And therefore, that also fits into the biggest issue driving the chronic disease problem is poor diet, more than anything else. That is the biggest factor. I'm not saying the other ones aren't important. I'm not saying that stress isn't important. Of course, it's massively important. I'm not saying good sleep isn't important. I'm not saying exercise is important, but the most important factor is what we're eating. And I think linked to that, Dan, I think it's important also to emphasize that there are a lot of people, certainly from the poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, where it becomes much harder to afford healthy food, and the ultra-processed food is a much cheaper, easier option. And they're not educated, they're not empowered, and therefore, and also the environment works against them. These are people who, you know, are struggling with with employment, are in low-paid jobs, who don't feel empowered, who don't feel valued in society, and that, you know, for them is a massive impact over time. That the psychological stress that goes with that, combined with the lifestyle that they adopt, is, you know, can actually influence their lifespan as much as reducing their lifespan by 20 years. 20 years. So this is actually, in many ways, the biggest issue when we look at it. You know, it's about basic, it's just about thinking about how do some people live and what are the structural issues that drive them to live in a certain way.
That's social injustice then, isn't it? That's what we're fighting, social injustice.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, I just want to go then into another round of questions, because I know your time is very limited, and it's called Devil's Advocate. So I'm going to give you some Devil's Advocate statements. I would like you to
I love Devil's Advocate.
Battle back with me a little bit. So I'm going to go to my sound effects department now. Devil's Advocate. There you go. The budget on this show is out of this world. Right. So let me just read these statements, and then, you know, you can take me down or agree with me, but I doubt you will. Okay. Encouraging people to eat more saturated fat is dangerous and irresponsible. And that's actually a quote I picked up from somebody who's throwing that your way. Over to you, Aseem.
Two things. I don't encourage people to eat more saturated fat. So I've never said to eat more. I would say that it's not, at minimum, it's not the major issue. At best, it's not at all linked. There's no consistent evidence showing that it links to the development of heart disease or death or stroke or really any major health condition. That's where I would start from. So I don't think that statement, Dan, that is backed up with any evidence. And of course, there's always going to be nuances. If someone was just to have a whole diet of pure bacon, for example, I don't think that would be particularly healthy. But the point I would make is that people shouldn't be avoiding saturated fat foods at high saturated fat, such as dairy, for example. What I advocate for is a kind of real food diet that minimizes and eliminates ultra-processed food, is low in sugar and low in refined carbohydrates. And if you're following that type of dietary pattern, there's no evidence that saturated fat should be counted or be part of something you need to be worried about.
Great. Okay, second one. We have an obesity epidemic because we've become lazy and don't move as much as we used to, which I guess we've kind of spoken about a little bit. But if you want to bat that one away, go for it.
Yeah, so a lot of mixed evidence about whether we're actually doing less exercise than we used to do. Some interesting data from the United States showing that over the years, the whole fitness industry has only developed in the last 2 or 3 decades. There are more gyms than there used to be 3-4 decades ago. There's a suggestion that actually we are more active than we were 3 or 4 decades ago. So I'd start from there. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle people being sedentary. So according to physical activity guidelines, 150 minutes of moderate activity a week is what we should be getting. The suggestion from data in the UK is that only 60% of adults are doing that, and even less so, interestingly, from people from Black and Asian and ethnic minority groups. So I would certainly encourage them to at least get that moderate level of activity up. But when it comes to obesity, I think there's very little link directly with being sedentary. I think the indirect link is that a lot of people that are sedentary, for example, the extreme end, might be people that are also, so-called couch potato, who are going to be more vulnerable to watching advertising of junk food and therefore eat more junk food. But when you break it down, lack of exercise, I'll give you a quote. So this is a man who is, his name is Lord Ian McCall. He was at one stage shadow health minister when John Major was in opposition. And he was rumored to be Margaret Thatcher's favorite doctor. Now, I've met Ian. He's actually a former surgeon, a very, very able, skilled surgeon, did a lot of humanitarian work. Great guy, okay? And, he said to me, and in fact, I quoted him in the Pyopi Diet, my first book. He says, and he's just making a point, an obese person doesn't need to do 1 iota of exercise in order to lose weight. They just need to eat less. Just to explain that, by doing nothing, Dan, our bodies, will burn just for breathing, for keeping a body temperature at a certain level, for our heart beating, for all the functions of our body. There's a lot of energy that goes into that. And we burn just by doing nothing, probably around 1,700 calories, about 60 to 75% of all the calories we burn come from doing nothing at all, just from functioning, from staying alive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you think about that, if you're then theoretically going in a calorie deficit under that, then you will lose weight. You don't need to be doing any exercise. Now, that doesn't mean I'm saying don't do exercise, but I'm just saying it's very basic physiology there.
Yeah, great. Okay. Right, the next one, a bit more controversial maybe, and the last one's very controversial. Right, this one. A shake a day keeps the weight away. A shake a day keeps the weight away.
So I think you're referring to this ultra processed low calorie shake. So
maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is essentially something that's been suggested that's going to be rolled out across the NHS as initial pilot scheme, and basically this comes from a randomized control trial published in The Lancet called Direct, which showed that of obese type 2 diabetics who took this, who adopted for 3 months 800 calorie a day diet, which consisted of shake and soups, then followed by introduction of meal plans. After a year, almost 50% of them had sent their type 2 diabetes into remission. So that, to start with, sounds great, very hopeful. We're talking about remission of type 2 diabetes when for years we were trained as doctors to say that it wasn't reversible or you couldn't go into remission, it was chronic and irreversible. So there's a good thing from that. When you break down the data, there's a few issues. One is it was only obese people who were enrolled. And at least, and certainly in this country, 50% of people who have type 2 diabetes are not obese. They're normal BMI or are overweight. So the question is it going to apply to them? The second thing is that it's an ultra-processed shake. So by definition, anything that has more than 5 ingredients that is industrially produced and has additives or preservatives in it is ultra-processed. And we know that it also has an adverse effect on the gut microbiome and the diversity of gut bacteria. So there's also a mindset issue here. Is this the way forward? And I'll come into alternatives in a second. So there's 800 calories. The third thing, which is what I call in evidence-based medicine, we call it the external validity of a trial. How useful is something in a control situation? How applicable is it to the real world? Well, it turns out only 1 in 4 people who were offered it, without an alternative, by the way, in the trial, for the trial specifically initially, actually then decided to go on the shake.
Wow.
So that means and then you're reporting on the results of the 1 in 4 that then, took the shake, for example, who did it for 3 months to start with, which means that it isn't, the headlines of 50% of remission from this in the real world actually is more like, best case scenario, 1 in 8 people.
So the stats are being slightly.
If 3 out of 4 people saying there's no way I'm going to take it, I don't want to take this as my only meal for 3 months, then there's a problem, right, in terms of how useful this is. Okay, I'm not saying it can't be used. I would say, it may be helpful for certain people. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. Certainly in that. The other thing I'd say is we don't have any long-term data. Now, you can argue the case saying Aseem about your 21-day plan, there's no long-term data either, and that's absolutely fair. But the alternative is to tell people to go on what we call a real food, don't count calories, cut out the refined carbohydrates, something that, David Unwin in the Real World GP that you've interviewed before has data on in, 150 of his patients. I think 82 or more than that, almost 50% of those have put their type 2 into remission. Now, I'm sure there are a number of patients that, David probably asked and maybe didn't want to go on the low carb, and of course that's fine, but we should be giving patients options. I don't see this as a long-term plan. I think it will fail miserably. And if you're not giving people all the evidence and saying there's an alternative approach, then it's not just evidence, it's not in keeping with the evidence-based medicine, and it won't work. You're going to get bad outcomes overall. It's not going to be the way forward, in my view. But, let's see what happens. But no, I'm pretty sure that this is not going to be the answer to the type 2 diabetes epidemic. And I think the other thing, Dan, is let's also not forget, ultimately, it's a food environment problem we're dealing with. Half of the British diet is ultra-processed food. We need to educate people on that, but we also need, we need the government to step in and protect people from those manipulations and excesses and regulate, and change the laws so that, they basically aren't allowed to get away with misleading people, which is what the food industry have been doing for decades.
Yeah, very profitably as well. Okay, well, the final one does actually relate to that completely. So again, this is a devil's advocate. Don't anyone quote me as saying that I agree with this statement. 1 cigarette does no harm. Let doctors enjoy one now and then during the COVID pandemic. And I can even take that further. What if a major tobacco firm was donating cigarettes to the staff at a hospital so they could just enjoy a cheeky cigarette? Of course, it does no harm, does it? Just 1 cigarette. Go.
Yeah, so 1 cigarette will kill you, but it's the issue is about over time, cigarettes, cause considerable harm to health. So I would use that. I know why you've said this in a provocative way. I would apply that to ultra-processed food. There's a great example of Krispy Kreme donuts, who were using the NHS as a branding opportunity to give a free donation of 1,500 donuts to one hospital trust, which I took issue with. Because it's already established. This isn't just this is not Aseem Malhotra's view. This is the view of the Medical Royal Colleges Academy. This is the BMA. They have already said that we should not be selling junk food in hospitals, and therefore there should not be a trust endorsing it. Now, does that mean that a doctor or nurse can't go and have, sneak out or bring a donut in or whatever, and we're going to? No, absolutely not. We're talking about what is the message that this is sending out about these sorts of foods. And certainly we know that ultra-processed food is at the root of many of the conditions that lead to adverse outcomes from COVID. So actually, and even in the short term, if you can do something about it, if you're a type 2 diabetic, Dan, I would argue that, theoretically, that actually these sorts of foods, if they raise your blood glucose considerably and you in the wrong place at the wrong time and you get COVID, it could actually be increasing your risk of death. We know that people who are admitted to hospital who are type 2, whose blood glucose was out of control, had a 10-fold increased risk of death compared to type 2s whose blood glucose was better controlled. Now think about those foods in an individual type 2 diabetic who over a period of time may be stressed out, eating lots of junk food, glucose is off the scale, and then they get COVID. Based on the data we've got, and we know that, blood glucose in itself, high blood glucose, infection thrives off high blood glucose. You get worse outcomes, not just from COVID-19. Theoretically, okay, I can't pinpoint the specific trial to say for sure, but if you put it all together, the likelihood is you're increasing your risk of death.
Wow.
So why is Krispy Kreme donuts donating the? For me, it's nothing short of an outrage. It's scandalous.
Yeah.
It's scandalous, actually, more than the Krispy Kreme donuts donating it to an NHS trust. Is the NHS trust in question putting out a tweet and congratulating and endorsing and being happy about this donation from a company that doesn't care about your health? They're a profit-making business, for God's sake.
Yep.
They don't give one iota of a damn about your health. They're there to make money. Let's not be naive about this.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, that's the devil's advocate. And we've just got a few questions from some of the listeners. Would it be okay if I shared a few? I know you've got...
Oh, absolutely. More than happy to.
So,
sure.
Okay, I've been sent so many, and I will just choose some of the ones that I think we probably haven't tackled up to now. This is by Danielle Stone, and she was on the podcast on Friday. She's a practice nurse, and she says, are medics encouraged to give out statins? Will we ever move away from promoting statins as a first port of call for the NHS? She then goes into a lot of details about how, as a practice nurse, she has to offer to patients the total cholesterol of 5 and a Q risk 2 above 10% of statins that we can code. This is, by the way, beyond my understanding. I hope it makes sense to you. As it is the recommended course of action. Same with the HbA1cs. I've been told it's not aggressive enough with the treatment. So apparently, basically, are we kind of encouraged, or are you encouraged as medics to give out statins? And are you able to kind of maybe go for maybe the lower fat or the, less of the damaging fat approach and the healthier fat approach instead?
So the answer to the question is yes. Unfortunately, there are targets that are set within the system. Doctors themselves are trusting the information they're being given that are based upon evidence. The reality is a lot of this information, what drives these decision-making, Dan, is actually influenced by the drug industry and academics who are supported by them, who are in very powerful and influential positions. What I would say is that how I deal with this is, and of course, not everybody can be an expert on everything, okay? But when it comes to statins, for example, a Q risk is an online calculator, which is a slightly crude assessment of giving you a risk of what your risk of heart attack or stroke is over the next 10 years. And unless your risk is over 20%, industry-sponsored data on statins suggests that you will not prolong your life from taking it, and there may be a small benefit in preventing heart attack or stroke. So I would have an informed, decision-making conversation with that patient and help them make the decision. Unfortunately, that isn't something that is routine across the NHS. The medical Royal Colleges and the BMJ in a joint campaign called Choosing Wisely, in a paper that if your listeners can look up because it's open access, and you can always challenge your doctor, or at least say, listen, to the nurse or doctor that, at the end of the day, no one can force you to take a pill. That would be assault. That would be assault. People need to realize that. But if you're not sure, then ask more questions to at the end of the day, it's your life. You're going to be taking this every day. To just have a transparent conversation. What is the actual benefit? What are the potential harms? Are there any alternatives? What happens if I do nothing? These are sort of the questions of something called Choosing Wisely. So if people Google Choosing Wisely and put in BMJ, Aseem Malhotra, if you like, a paper will come up that was published with co-authors who were the most eminent doctors in the UK, the former chair of the GMC, chair of the Medical Royal Colleges. And basically it was a campaign that was launched in 2015 to wind back the harms of too much medicine. So a lot of members of the establishment and senior doctors know this, but to get this, to get this within medical training and to make this part of routine practice takes time, but it needs to be fought for. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, excellent. Mandy has said, has he any response from Boris about the government plans to tackle obesity, and how does he deal with the trolls on Twitter?
I've not had direct communication with Boris. I have had direct communication with Matt Hancock, the Secretary for Health and Social Care, who had asked me after I'd come out and highlighted that the reason Boris got particularly sick from COVID was likely related to his weight, and then Boris seemed to acknowledge that. So I take that as a backhanded compliment that he was wanting to do something about his weight and also to help the population get healthier. Matt Hancock did acknowledge the information I gave him. A lot of it is written in the book anyway, so people can read the book, so that's in there. And I haven't had any further communication with Matt other than me exchanging, trying to send him the book. Essentially, he wanted the book, and he gave me details about where to send it to. So I'm waiting for feedback from the book from Matt so far. How do I deal with trolls? I think, you learn from history from people before me that have had to, go up against big industry in what they do. And some of it disseminates down to trolling on Twitter. Some of it is coming from clearly people who are have some financial connection to industry. Some of them aren't. Some are just unsavory characters, I think is the way I would describe them.
Yeah.
It's just you've got to grow a rhinoceros hide. As soon as your work threatens an industry or an ideological cabal, you will be attacked, sometimes unrelentingly and viciously. So grow a rhinoceros hide.
And personally as well. Personally.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
They don't attack your ideas, do they?
Listen, I'm not perfect, and sometimes I do react when maybe I shouldn't. I think there's a great inspirational quote from George Bernard Shaw. Never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it.
Yeah.
I think that's a message for everybody, really. I think a lot of us get trolling on Twitter. A lot of people I know, a lot of people who are well-known broadcasters and celebrities who I'm friends with, who message me and get very upset about it. Who I have great respect for their work, and I just think, wow, it's unfortunately become more and more widespread on Twitter, in particular. So I think that the best way, either mute or block them. I used to mute people, but now I'm just like, I just don't want to see anything from them. So I just any troll or anyone that I think, I'm up for reasoned debate, but when I think that their intentions are malicious, a lot of the time that's a personal intuitive decision sometimes, I will block them.
Yeah, fair enough. And actually, that's the other thing. You don't have to engage in a debate with somebody just because they're throwing muck at you, do you? That's the thing about social media. You can choose to ignore it. It's just social media. It's not real life in many ways. People throw things out, and you don't have to engage with any of it unless you don't want to. And I've realised that's the hard way.
And Dan, to be honest, it's a distraction for me. I'm doing this as a campaigner and activist. It does take a lot of time and my energies, and I need to be fully on it. Why distract myself on that stuff? That's the other reason I don't engage, because it ends up wasting my time.
Totally agree.
And it's a distraction from more important things that I need to do.
So during the general election, I had exactly the same. You'd get Tories and Lib Dems trying to engage you in a conversation. They're not really trying to have a conversation. They're trying to waste your time and have a bit of a spat. You just ignore it. Okay, the next one's quite a good question. And it's by Eve Doxia. I don't think that's a real name, but that's a cool name for it. It's amazing. If fasting insulin should be added to the 5 criteria for metabolic syndrome.
So in different countries, people can get blood tests for fasting insulin. I think that, with a very sort of real 101 in medicine, something I teach my medical students, something I was taught.
Yeah.
Don't organize a test. Don't do a test unless it's going to change your management.
Right. Fasting
insulin is expensive. That isn't the reason not to do it. Are there alternative ways of checking whether somebody has insulin resistance? Certainly to a degree that needs to be concerning. And yes, those are those markers of metabolic health that I'm talking about. So, and then if they have that abnormality, or you think someone's insulin resistant, you're going to give them a plan, which is essentially going to be around, a real food, healthy diet, moderate exercise, stress reduction, etc. So, in my own clinical practice, Dan, both in the NHS and privately, I don't get it done. I don't even, I don't waste people's money. A lot of people come see me privately and they're surprised because I'm not routinely organizing lots of tests that they don't need, which is going to end up them spending unnecessary amounts of money. You don't need to do that.
Yeah.
So the answer is, it may be helpful for a few people. Yes, I'm not saying it's not helpful, but for most people, you don't need to get it done.
Okay, excellent. Maya says, can you ask him, so I'm asking you now, who advised the government on their terrible decision to the shakes and soups and processed food for diabetics? And why do they not follow the science and suggest a low carb diet instead? And by the way, I just want to say this. I used to teach in Matt Hancock's constituency, and so I know him well-ish as a teacher, and I know that he himself followed a low carbohydrate diet, didn't he? So why?
Yeah, in fact, he admitted that even Piopi diet was something that, it sounds like that. It was after I gave him the book and I spoke in Parliament last year, and then a few months later, I think Tom Watson obviously inspired him as well.
Yeah.
So indirectly, probably yes, whatever it's low carb, but certainly yes, he said that low carb helped him. And so he knows it, okay? I think to answer that question, unfortunately, is very simple: follow the money. The real battle we have in healthcare and in politics is one of truth versus money. That's it. So, what does that mean? The people influencing, government at the very top are the people with the money, the people where the money is maldistributed, where they've got this trial from this sheikh that was, is ultra processed, and there are people that low carb threatens that, doesn't it? If you've got something better that isn't a commodity, isn't something you can market, but it actually is just doctors and GPs and physicians telling patients to go low carb, and it's going to have a much bigger, better outcome. What do you do if you're that business? The way that these people operate is you push you influence, you try and influence practice, you get your message out through the media, you influence politicians. And unfortunately, I think some of these people also engage in specific tactics to try and suggest that low carb is dangerous. So this is all part of the corporate playbook, Dan. These are just symptoms of our system failure. The fact the government is pushing this out is a symptom of our system failure, basically. The fact that we don't actually live in a real, true democracy. The fact that money is maldistributed. And if there's one very interesting documentary which I posted on Facebook, which if people don't really understand the system in 1 hour and 17 minutes, just watch a documentary on Netflix called Saving Capitalism. That will help you explain a lot of that's wrong with our system.
And can I just say this as well? There's only one solution to that problem with capitalism, which obviously capitalism itself isn't a bad thing, and it's democracy. And what you find is it's always a battle between those two things. So public health reform in the 19th century did not properly happen until most men had the vote in the 1870s. Then by the 1920s and onwards, when women get the vote as well, you then see huge changes suddenly in public policy. Before that time, you can be ignored. But if you don't vote, if you don't engage the political process, and if you think yourself a consumer and not a citizen, then that's when you get disenfranchised by the system, which will very happily sell you rubbish and take profit from your pocket without actually giving you any benefit whatsoever.
Yeah. So in very simple terms, people are voting. I draw the comparison to evidence-based medicine, the triad I use when I describe what evidence-based medicine is. People are basically making decisions on biased and deliberately manipulated information. And when that happens across the system, you're not going to get real proper democracy. Democracy is not going to function properly. You're going to get a lot of anger. Injustices are going to happen. So I think that's just, it's a different discussion, a wider topic, but that really summarizes, and that has also, unfortunately, Dan, infiltrated itself amongst medicine as well. Doctors are making clinical decisions on biased information. And if you're doing that, you're going to get bad outcomes. And that's what we've got. We've got a healthcare crisis. We've got a system that's collapsing, basically.
Yeah. And we could go into that massively because that's really my thing. Every general election I get asked, how much longer can we afford to pay for the NHS? And it's very pervasive how some people also want to have a privatized system thinking that's somehow better for us. And I would say, of course it's not. Just going to share some words of encouragement as well for Bill, because I've got more questions, but I know your time is precious. So Mark Hancock, who I know actually, Mark, from the Public Health Collaboration, he says he probably has no idea how many have listened to his wisdom and can change lives for the better. So that's a big thank you from him. And Carol says, just tell him to keep up the good work. So there you go. You've got a lot of support out there on your side. Aseem, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I've got about another 10 pages or so of questions and things I'd love to go into with you in the future. So maybe you could come back on in the future. We can do a part 2. I'd be delighted, Dan. It's been really enjoyable for me too. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And where's the best place to connect with you? You've got a Twitter account, I know, but also a website. So what's your handle? Yeah, so my website is draseem.com, but most of the stuff I post is usually through Twitter, which is at Dr Aseem Malhotra, Facebook, just my name. And then Instagram, people are on Instagram, it's Lifestyle Medicine Doctor. So that's sort of my social media handles. Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll carry on, pushing the message of truth. And I know, of course, I mentioned this before we started recording today. We're doing a fast, come fast with us. And it's basically a community fast supporting each other. And it could be somebody doing a 16-hour fast for the first time. I did one in July with a few others, and now we're going to have more people involved. And that's the 20th of September to the 5th of September. You're more than welcome to join us if you wish to the 5th of October, you mean? Or 25th? Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's quite a long fast, isn't it? The 20th of September to the 25th of September, should I say. Great, so Sunday to I'll be delighted, Dan. I'll be delighted. That's great. Thank you. And I think that encouragement will help all of us along. Thank you so much for your time today. And all the best with the book. And I'm sure we'll hear much more from you in the future. Lovely, Dan. Great to see you. Cheers.